seminar on violence, technology, and law. That throughout 3 days, we'll reflect on the role of technology in production and reproduction of daily violence and its forms of regulation. So the idea of this event, it was actually built 2 years ago when I met Andrés from Sicilia from the University of London and Fabio Ferraz from the University of Jyväskylä, right? So I rehearsed a lot to say this name, pronounce the name in Finland. And when we had the idea for this event, it was during a workshop on violence and urban security carried out in March 2020 in Rio by the British Academy and the Brazilian Academy of Science. So obviously, when we received the financing for this event, we were the pandemic was ongoing, so this delayed for 2 years our ideas, our execution. But now it's a great pleasure to start our debate. And it's very important to mention that this event will occur, this webinar will take place throughout 3 days. Today, right, the 15th, September 15th, next week on September 22nd, a Thursday at the same time, and then in the last week of September on the 29th, also at the same time and through the same channels. So our idea was to spread the event throughout 3 events so it wouldn't be like too hectic for people, and so everybody could follow us throughout all the debates. So the event, it's being funded by the British Academy. We're grateful to the British Academy for this support, but it had also been supported by the University of Arts London and obviously by the Nucleus of Studies of Violence from the University of São Paulo, which has been providing us with technical support, institutional support, all the academic support, which we are absolutely grateful, mainly to the coordinator of the Nucleus, NEV, which is Marcos Alvarez and Chris Uchoa, which has been supporting us in this process. And I'd also like to thank the University of Arts of London on the other end. I'd like to thank Alessia Catani that's been supporting us on this event since the beginning, and she's been one of the main connections in this event. Our idea with all these events was to gather researchers from the North and South to reflect of how old and new technologies interact and become direct agents and even indirect agents in the production of violence. So we start by the point that technology, it is a social process, and therefore it tends to reproduce the same problems, the same social problems in a way that sometimes it reproduces these gaps and these tensions in a silent way, in a natural way, sometimes without any perception or any discussion on it. But as a whole, we understand that technologies nowadays are reproduction vectors of all kinds of violence. And regarding violence, we understand not necessarily the direct violence, physical assault, but also other types of violence, which could be can occur in the symbolic field indirectly, and other types of violence that express in terms of discrimination, segregation, exclusion, and identity gap. So it's we're really proud to start today this series of seminars, and I'd like to very briefly describe what would be the 3 panels. Well, today's panel discusses about how new technologies have arisen in the global scenario and how these technologies on surveillance and characterized by the massive collection of data and through algorithmic systems, how they impact the social practices of public security and international security, how these technologies and how the violence has been reproduced and encouraged by these technologies. So next week, at the same time, and at the same day on a Thursday, we will discuss specifically these technologies, surveillance technologies and digital technologies, and its applications in Brazil. And the reason for this is because we understand that these technologies do not follow a single script. Right? They do not have a single way of usage. And very often these technologies applied to security and public security in other countries end up impacting in different ways in our country and other social realities, because they compose these different layers in society. And therefore, we will be discussing the impacts of these technologies, surveillance technologies in Brazil. And in the last week, in September, we will also discuss on the same day at the same time, on a Thursday at 2 p.m. Brazil time. We will discuss the introduction of new systems. In fact, how in court these surveillance systems and the production of images have been impacting trials. And it's important to understand that we've been in a society that produces and reproduces videos constantly. And these videos have been used more often in courtrooms, in legal departments to produce all these lawsuits, and how this impacts, how this production occurs, how this creates many other discussions of great importance to think about the technology in the legal system. Therefore, I would like to thank everyone who's been attending the Congress today from all different nationalities, and say that we are really proud. I speak on behalf of Fabio Ferraz, my colleague and coordinator of the event, and also Andreas. And before handing the microphone, I'd like to thank Lucy Suchman for being here today with us, and also Natalie Byfield, both of which I respect greatly, and I follow vigorously your publications and your papers. Once again, thank you, and I'd like to hand the word to my friend Andreas from the University of Arts London, who will command this panel. One more time, thank you all, and have a great event. So look forward to having you next week.
Thank you, Alcides. I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining this event on behalf of University of the Arts London, where I'm based, and who is co-hosting this series of events with the Center for the Studies of Violence at the University of Sao Paulo. It's my pleasure to introduce this first panel and the two speakers that we have lined up, Professor Natalie P. Byfield and Professor Lucy Suchman. I think that these are two speakers and scholars who are very relevant to this project, insofar as they're not only working across academic disciplines, but their work also makes connections between academia and other domains, such as activism, campaigning, and journalism. So it's a real pleasure to have them with us here today. Lucy Suchman is Professor Emerita of the Anthropology of Science and Technology at Lancaster University in the UK. Her research works at the intersections of anthropology and the field of feminist science and technology studies, focused on cultural imaginaries and material practices of technology design. Her current research extends her long-standing critical engagement with the fields of artificial intelligence and human-computer interaction to the domain of contemporary militarism. She's concerned with the question of whose bodies are incorporated into military systems, how and with what consequences for social justice and the possibility for a less violent world. Dr. Natalie P. Byfield is the founding director of the Institute for Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at St. John's University. She is also a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Her research is interdisciplinary. It is broadly concerned with the role of knowledge in the exercise of power and control under racial capitalism. She studies the ways in which people from dominant groups create knowledge and information for the purposes of subjugation. In her research, Dr. Byfield draws on examples from essential societal features like policing, language use, media systems, digital algorithmic technologies, and research methods to illustrate the ways in which American societies use knowledge production to maintain white supremacy. Dr. Byfield is the author of Savage Portrayals, Race, Media, and the Central Park Jogger Story, which came out with Temple University Press in 2014. Her current book project is titled Minority Report, Place, Race, and State Surveillance in New York City. So the way the panel will work is each of our speakers will have around 30 minutes to present. And then after that, we'll have plenty of time, around an hour, I think, for questions with the audience. So I'll pass over to Lucy Suchman for the first presentation.
Thank you so much, Alcides and Andres, and I'm really happy to be here and happy to be here in conversation with Natalie in particular. So I come to the topic of our panel from my work at the intersections of anthropology and science and technology studies, STS, along with more recent engagements in international relations and critical security studies. So the law has come into my work only indirectly, as I've joined in efforts to oppose further automation of the US warfighting machine. Arguably and tragically, the most massive socio-technical system on the planet. I do this as part of a larger commitment to demilitarization and affiliated efforts like Natalie's to redress the injuries of empire, colonialism, and extractive capitalism. And just to say that my focus is going to be on the US military in its operations outside the United States, but increasingly, I think we recognize that the differences between military operations outside the so-called homeland and policing domestically those borders are increasingly porous, and the relations are very long-standing. So that's the context for my remarks today. But I want to focus here on the more specific questions, since we're framing our conversation in relation to law, the more specific question of the laws of war. And I'm just going to start my screen sharing so that I can show some slides. And I'm hoping you can all see that. Okay. So the limits on legal killing in war are inscribed most prominently in international humanitarian law, a body of customary law developed in the aftermath of World War II as part of the Geneva Conventions. Rule number 1 of IHL is the principle of distinction, which states that, quote, the parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants. Attacks may only be directed against combatants. Most and increasingly problematic is the fact that the principle of distinction between combatants and those who are out of combat presupposes the stability of those categories and the warfighter's ability to recognize the difference between them. And there's a great deal more that could be said about that, which I'd be glad to come back to in the discussion. But even more fundamentally, IHL is based on the military imaginary of a legible battle space and a fighting force subject to rational decision-making and operational control. It's this imaginary that underwrites investments in the automation of what's called command, control, communications, and intelligence, an acronym named C3I in the 1980s that has continued to be elaborated over the subsequent decades as compute power and network infrastructures have expanded. The continuing aim of the US military is to secure what historian Paul Edwards names a closed world in the form of a dome of global technological oversight. This is a techno-political imaginary that emerged through the US doctrine of containment in 1946 and culminated in the US-Soviet arms race of the 1980s with Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense, or Star Wars, initiative. Together, these and other developments resulted in an acceleration of efforts towards centralized, remotely controlled military operations based on advanced computing and communications. They disclosed as well, Edwards observes, quote, a wide gap between an official discourse of success and the pessimistic assessments of independent observers, including American soldiers on the ground, end of the quote. And this is a crucial point and one that I'll come back to. My involvement with these issues is part of a long-standing critical engagement with computing, particularly robotics and artificial intelligence, starting in the 1980s, when I joined my colleagues at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, where I was then a researcher, in challenging the reliability of computer control in the launch of nuclear weapon systems. The same year that Reagan launched his Star Wars program, the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, that's DARPA, announced a 10-year companion initiative called the Strategic Computing Initiative. The centerpiece was the goal of providing weapons systems within the initiative's phrasing, quote, human-like intelligent capabilities. Severo Ornstein, a computer scientist who'd worked on the first strategic air defense system, the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE, Brian Cantwell-Smith, then a recent PhD in AI from MIT, and I, an anthropology PhD student at the University of California at Berkeley, wrote a critique of the Strategic Computing Initiative for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, arguing that it blurred the distinction between progress in computer science and wishful thinking. And I would suggest that the details of that critique could be recycled some 40 years later with just a small amount of updating to address contemporary plans for AI-based weapon systems. And a lot of my work is focused on that. In the current moment, the fantasy of a dome of global technological oversight has been reanimated through the promise of AI. What we're seeing here is an artist's rendering of the Israeli Defense Forces projected sensor-to-shooter network named Fireweaver, designed to provide troops with, quote, real-time, accurate battle information displayed directly on their weapons sites, including artificial intelligence algorithms to process data and prioritize fires allocation. This graphic is indicative of an imaginary shared across the US Defense Department and its allies. In 2010, I joined the International Committee for Robot Arms Control and became part of a campaign led by Human Rights Watch for a preemptive ban on the development and use of weapon systems in which target identification and the initiation of attack has been put under fully automatic machine control. The principal location for the campaign to date has been the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or CCW, a body charged with establishing, quote, prohibitions or restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. So the question of discrimination, going back to rule number 1 of IHL, is central here. Following a report to the Human Rights Council in 2013 by Christoph Haynes, then the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions, member states agreed to begin discussions on what are now referred to as lethal autonomous weapon systems, or interestingly, the acronym LAWS. In this photo, I'm on a panel presenting testimony at the CCW in April of 2016 on the question of machine autonomy. And I have a lot of very complicated feelings about the trope of machine autonomy, which again, I'd be glad to elaborate. But for purposes of this panel, my summary argument was this. First of all, that autonomy implies self-directed action, including, crucially in the case of military operations, action according to rules, given that the premise of military operations is that they are governed by rules, including, importantly, IHL. In the case of human action, action according to rules, like IHL, in every case presupposes capabilities that the rules do not and cannot fully specify. In particular, it presupposes those competencies that are required to establish an accountable relation between the conditions assumed by the rule and an actual unfolding situation. In the case of a weapon system that would be adherent to IHL, machine autonomy would require reliable, unambiguous translation of rules for what is in military terms called situational awareness, particularly for the identification of legitimate human targets, according to the principle of distinction. It would require the translation of those rules into machine executable code. Contrary to assertions regarding rapid advances in artificial intelligence and robotics, there is no empirical evidence of progress in operationalizing the capacities of situational awareness that are presupposed by and required for adherence to the principle of distinction. This then raises serious doubts regarding the feasibility of lethal autonomous weapons that would be adherent to IHL. So in sum, the defining question for autonomous weapons, I argued, is whether the discriminatory capacities that are the precondition for legal killing can be reliably and unambiguously encoded. My argument was that they cannot, and that therefore lethal autonomous weapons are in violation of IHL and should be prohibited. One of the most significant developments in the context of the CCW debates occurred when the NGO Article 36, named after Article 36 of the UN Charter on, quote, the Pacific settlement of disputes. Article 36 proposed the concept of meaningful human control as a requirement for the acceptability of weapon systems. That is, that weapon systems must be subject to meaningful human control. That trope has now been widely adopted as a desideratum by participants in the CCW discussions. And this phrase has very usefully, I think, slowed the debate as participants deal with the question of what meaningful human control comprises. My colleague in the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, Noel Sharkey, along with others, has provided very helpful analyses of what are set out as 5 levels of human supervisory control over weapon systems, from the ideal case where a human deliberates about a target before initiating any attack, to the weakest and most dangerous case where target identification and the initiation of attack is entirely automated. The intermediate cases involve various modes of human selection, approval, or veto in relation to options provided by the system. Because these intermediate states are subject to a bias toward confirmation, and there are all sorts of studies that show that, ICRAC that's the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, ICRAC maintains that level 1, that is the ideal case of time for human deliberation, is a requirement for meaningful human control. And this is in direct tension with the further automation of weapon systems. So considering that tension, ICRAC's position is that the design of weapon systems must render them incapable of operating without meaningful human control. And this, by definition, would render lethal autonomous weapons illegal. So here in these, in many ways, sort of beautifully crafted arguments is where my dilemma arises. The presence of a so-called human in the loop of military violence is widely accepted as the essential condition for accountability. But the figure of the human and the loop really belies the complexities of distributed socio-technical information and communications networks and their associated agencies with all of their irremediable noise and equivocality. If the premise of control is to be maintained, it can only be meaningful to the extent that the intelligence that informs it is accountable, most basically to requirements regarding the identification of legitimate targets, that is, those who are in combat. And it's here that the concept of meaningful human control loops back to connect with that of situational awareness. Situational awareness requires an openness to the nuance and complexity of realities on the ground in sites of military operations, as well as the ways in which, in order to be meaningful, control needs to recognize its limits. And both situational awareness and meaningful human control require time and a space for deliberation that the intensification of automation in warfighting further diminishes. As just one piece of evidence, the extensive investigations by Ahmad Khan for the New York Times published at the end of last year, the two series called The Civilian Casualty Files and The Civilian Toll of US Air Wars, show that the principle of distinction is systematically violated in military operations, quite apart from the question of lethal autonomous weapon systems. So Ahmad Khan writes, quote, "Over the past 3 years, I obtained more than 1,300 credibility assessments from the US Defense Department through the Freedom of Information Act. The reports cover allegations surrounding airstrikes that took place between September 2014 and January 2018. What I saw after studying them was not a series of tragic errors, which is the way the US military always accounts for its assassination and killing of civilians. So not a series of tragic errors, but a pattern of impunity, of a failure to detect civilians, to investigate on the ground, to identify causes and lessons to be learned, to discipline anyone or find wrongdoing that would prevent these recurring problems from happening again. It was a system that seemed to function almost by design to not only mask the true toll of American airstrikes, but also to legitimize their expanded use." And along with these records, Khan's reporting is based on 5 years of on-the-ground investigations. And she concludes, "On the ground, I found a pattern of life that was very different from the one that the military described in its credibility assessments, and documented death rates that vastly exceeded US Central Command's own numbers. I also came away with a grim understanding of how America's new high-tech air war looks to civilians who live beneath it, people in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan trying to raise families, earn a living, and stay away from the fighting as best they can," end quote. So much as I believe that campaigns like that against autonomous weapon systems are necessary, I also feel that they're not sufficient. In recent writings, I've tried to contribute to a wider critique of the fundamental premises of command and control in warfighting, including the bases of targeting and the fallacy of claims for precision. I've taken the military trope of situational awareness as a hook to question the cognitivist, rationalist models that dominate military imaginaries, from the individual warfighter to current initiatives in so-called joint all-domain command and control. If these closed world imaginaries deny their leaky boundaries, disclosing those openings in the ways that people like Khan have done provides an opportunity for critical intervention. Carlo Caduff's prescient account of the early warning system developed to monitor emergent pandemics could just as well apply to the military imaginary of all-domain command and control. So he writes, quote, "The vision of a, quote, global surveillance network and early warning system described by experts in reports is often more virtual than real. The network is dispersed, the ties are thin, the surveillance erratic, and the meaning of the information uncertain. The network is fragmented and fraught with inconsistencies. It is pictured as a seamless system of surveillance, but this is primarily the network's own mythology of coherence, logic, and rationality. The work of challenging that mythology is being done by a growing coalition of researchers and investigative journalists. To take just one example on the research side, critical international relations scholars Nicola Perugini and Neve Gordon consider the generative effects of military investment in machinery of situational awareness based on the subjection of big data to algorithmic analysis. Perugini and Gordon write, "Following Foucault's notion of dispositif, we understand these new technologies and epistemic operations as part of an apparatus of distinction, which denotes an array of interrelated forces that frame, shape, produce, construe, and thus give meaning to the relationship among the actors within the battle space. In an argument resonant with the project of critical investigative journalism, Judith Butler directs our attention to the limits of intelligibility as a kind of methodological strategy that provides an opening for change. In a 2002 essay, she writes, quote, "So not only is it necessary to isolate and identify the peculiar nexus of power and knowledge that gives rise to the field of intelligible things, but also to track the way in which that field meets its breaking point, the moments of its discontinuities, the sites where it fails to constitute the intelligibility for which it stands. What this means is that one looks both for the conditions by which the object field is constituted, but also for the limits of those conditions, the moments where they point up their contingency and their transformability. So rather than further incorporation into the closed world imaginary of datafication, military operations need rereading through a performative understanding of accountable perception and action. Read in that way, the radical openness of worlds poses an enduring problem for the project of security through military dominance and containment. So I end with this problem that I hope we can come back to in our discussion. How do we draw upon the resources that the law provides to challenge the military in its own terms? And I'm framing this again in terms of the military, but I think it's true for the law more broadly. So how do we draw upon the resources that the law provides us to challenge the military or other institutions in their own terms, in the cases that I've been talking about, international humanitarian law, without implicitly endorsing the normative premises that command and control is actually operationally possible? And in the context of the CCW debates, for me, the requirement to engage with the trope of meaningful human control, to call for that as a requirement, requires bracketing out of the frame everything that we know about the lack of meaningful human control in military operations on an ongoing basis. I understand the value of doing that, again, within the context of the CCW. And yet I feel very much that tension of what's required, what the assumptions that we have to leave unquestioned in order to work within these legal frameworks. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to Natalie's comments in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that fascinating presentation. I'll now hand over to Natalie, but I should just say that for anyone who's accessing the live stream via YouTube, you're welcome to begin submitting questions for the discussion after the presentation. So you can submit those questions now. We'll be collecting them throughout Natalie's presentation, ready for the Q&A session afterwards. So I'll now pass over to Natalie Byfield.
Thank you, Alcides. My thanks again also to all the organizers. It's a pleasure to be able to present with you here today, Lucy, and our discussions afterwards. I'll go ahead and share the screen now. So my work that I'm sharing today is taking a look at how racial bias is becoming embedded in contemporary surveillance technologies. I I began this work some years ago after in New York City, in part because I was initially examining the type immigrants to the city had as they used public spaces. And essentially was this work that took me back to an examination of in our society today as we saw the convergence of information capitalism, the rise of mass incarceration. So the rise grows out of the new technologies that have been developed, allow for the rise of our digital platforms and that allowed our digital platforms global dominance. The way these platforms operated essentially represented a revolution in communication technology, in communications, and because the various types of communications, such as still moving images and text, as well as audio, could be rendered as digital data. All of this allowed for the convergence onto this one platform. Convergence allows transmission infrastructure to be used for different services. The technological that led to the rise of information capitalism, allowed data to become one of the most important commodities in the public and private sectors. And the platforms underpinning the data doubles, essentially, that exists for all of us in these databases, can and will be controlled by the state. With such developments, the state has sometimes found itself in many conflicts with private enterprise over the collection and use and control of people's personal data, particularly in the area of security. Part of what the ascendance of data or information in our world has also led the major Western states to once again exist at the forefront of information capitalism, because many of the advancements took place in those states. But some of these major Western states also represent the racial states that rose to prominence as colonial states under another system of capitalism. So this phase of information capitalism in the United States in particular, but not only the United States, but I can United States by way of the number of case studies that apply here. Over the past 50 years, there's been a transformation in the institutions that by design are supposed to foster social control, either through socialization and or forced conformity. And so the transformations taking place in those institutions came out through the rise of law and order agendas in the political sphere, in particular, 1960s. And they have just, the law and order agenda has increased over time. What we've seen come out of the rise, the development of, or the transformation in the institutions, for example, has been an expansion in the instituted mandatory minimum prison sentences, increases in the lengths of prison sentences, and a plethora of new laws that drastically expanded and or created new federal bureaucratic regimes to help local communities address a perceived crime problem, which typically translated into local surveillance from the federal level. This expansion in the criminal justice system also affected, of course, ancillary agencies and non-governmental agencies over the same time period. So part of this expansion of the actually also represented an expansion of the carceral state. The judiciary branches of government in the US played a very significant role in social control through rulings from the bench that greatly expanded local police powers in the communities they're supposed to serve. This expansion of local police powers typically extended in the area of discretionary power, police discretion. One of the most significant judicial decisions made by the US Supreme Court during this era in the court's support of the police is the landmark case of Terry versus Ohio, in which the US Supreme Court ruled that the police do not violate people's consent against unlawful searches and seizures when they stop and search people on the street in an investigatory manner. But this ruling reduced essentially the strictures that police experience under the Fourth Amendment that required them to establish probable cause before a stop. I'm providing just a table, an image here that gives us a sense of the mass incarceration system as it exists in the US and the millions of people that have been confined in various federal, state, and local jails. As you can see, state prisons are responsible for much of the incarceration or the rise in incarceration rates across. So the emergence of the carceral state atop the foundation of information capitalism should encourage scholars to assess surveillance practices, particularly racialized surveillance practices, for the following: the collection, management, and mining of this data by policing agencies for social control, specifically racialized social control, the ease with which gather data from disparate and discrete sources in our digital lives, and the significance of those changes to the latest era of policing that engages strategies like predictive policing. This latest era of policing is often referred to as intelligence-led policing. And finally, we should also be concerned with the scientific methodologies and processes underlying use in the continuing development of policing as a form of racism and repression. Is the ways in which we can tease out how racism becomes embedded in the technologies, given the rise of information capitalism and the expansion of the carceral state. And struck me is that many researchers, including carceral state researchers, studying the culture of control in racial states, particularly racial states that started as sets do not center racism and racialization in their research and analysis. And in studying the capitalism, centering racism and racialization may, to me, reveal new ways in which racism intersects with other forms of social control, particularly the type of social control where we see being incorporated into our daily lives through the use of these technologies. And so hopefully this can help us to identify new forms of state repression and ultimately new ways of combating it. So the focus of what I will focus on in the next sections of the presentation are the significance of mass incarceration in that form, and the scientific methodologies and processes underlying these developments and their use in the continued development of. Those are the latter two on my list. A close look at New York City. This is, I spend much of my time looking at policing in New York City and how that is unfolding. And the history of racial profiling as it exists or across the US is primarily we have to include. And essentially, I'll just define it for us here so that we're on the same page with the way we are thinking. I'm thinking about being executed in the US. I'm using a definition from the American Civil Liberties Union, which defines it as discriminatory practice by law enforcement officials of targeting individuals for suspicion of crime based on the individual's race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. Racial profiling stepped up enormously in New York City during the 1990s, after a period of particularly high crime in the 1980s. During the 1980s, we also saw the development of a theory which was broken windows theory that was used, that became incorporated in policing because it was formulated around the idea that if stopped minor infractions or found a way to reduce minor infractions, they would reduce the likelihood. As broken windows theory, which was developed in the early 1980s, as broken windows theory increased use of broken windows theory across policing agencies in the US took place. CompStat, a system for essentially a computerized mapping system for tracking crime, and was able to support the expansion of broken windows theory because CompStat supported it by recording and analyzing data collected primarily from police. And so this is where stop and frisk, or stop, question, and frisk comes in, because stop, question, and frisk is a policing practice that essentially allows police, in part through the Terry law, to detain pedestrians for the purposes of ensuring that they're not committing a crime or have the intent for committing a crime, because as a result of the Terry law, police can now stop pedestrians on the basis of coming out of the high crime rates of the 1980s. The mayoralty of Rudolph Giuliani, who has gained attention, national and international attention, in part through the 9/11 period, as well as this most recent period as an a follower and an acolyte of the former President Trump, he stepped up the practice of stop and frisk in New York City. In this work, I think it behooves us not to make a distinction between stop, question, and frisk and the types of hyper-policing that have historically happened in communities of color, particularly Black communities, that date back to the turn of the 20th century. Some of the work, one particular study, Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Muhammad, does an excellent job identifying between the hyper-policing of Black communities during this period and social science, the racism in social science, and how it used statistical analysis as a way to embed racist ideologies into practices in policing and social science. And so the stop and frisk practice certainly can trace its roots to this earlier period. But as it was being deployed in New York City in the 1990s under the Giuliani administration, it was happening during a period where there was in fact decrease in crime rates. And after the Giuliani administration, the administration of Michael Bloomberg stepped up stop practices again. And once again, this took place during a period of decrease in crime rates. So this illustration from a study by the New York Civil Liberties Union provides an indication of the numbers of stops, these pedestrian investigatory stops based on police discretion and police suspicion. This gives you a sense of how these stops grew under the Bloomberg administration. And the steep decline that you see in 2013 at the end of the Bloomberg administration comes from a federal judge ruling the practice way unconstitutional, violating the Fourth Amendment in part. And so the numbers of stops here across the city peaked at one point in 2011 about, and when you total those, we have about 5 million pedestrian stops during the Bloomberg administration, and tens of thousands of these stops occurred in predominantly Black neighborhoods, particularly in central Brooklyn, where you have the largest, a borough, one of the boroughs in New York City. New York has 5 boroughs. And in Brooklyn, that's where you see the largest numbers of Black population and also Black immigrant population. Again, this is data from the New York Civil Liberties Union, and part of what we see here are the people, and we see it broken down by race. So these people were essentially stopped and released because there was absolutely no reason to bring them out. This is a map of New York City, and part of what you see in the darkest colored areas, they essentially correspond. These are some of the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, central Brooklyn, where you see high rates of stops. Again, areas in Queens, another borough in Brooklyn, where I am right now, actually, another area experiencing high rates of stop. This is the Bronx, an area that is areas that are predominantly Latino. These are police precincts in Harlem, again, in areas that were during these time periods communities. This one area here is the shopping area, the commercial areas in Manhattan. To help us I'm providing you here with what is called a UF 250 form, which is used by police to collect data on all individuals who are stopped. This UF 250 form has been used during prior administrations, other than the Bloomberg administration. But part of what's so interesting about how a form like this has been used to collect data is that in prior mayoral administrations, going back to the Giuliani administration, it was used relatively infrequently. But as the stops increased under the Bloomberg administration, the use of the form became required, and the police management enforced the use of the form, or enforced that rule that officers fill out this document to collect data on the people. As you can see here, there are a variety of different types of data that are collected. We see things like scars, tattoos. They collect, of course, racial data. The racial categories that they're concerned with are Black, white, white Hispanic, and Black Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, American Indian, and Alaska Native. In addition to collecting those types of data, part of what they have to incorporate in the collection of information is the reasons that they made the stop. And so if you look at the top of the form here, the reasons that they give are things like furtive movement, or action indicative of acting as a lookout, or a suspicious bulge, or other reasonable. And I would insert this and say that they're collecting data not just on what led to the stop, but also if they do search, then what led to the search. As you can see on the back of the form here, they have, again, similar criteria: furtive movement, what they consider reasonable suspicion of weapons, refusal to comply with the officer's direction. But other things that I think are important, quite important to draw your attention to, are some of these additional circumstances or factors that lead sometime to either a stop or a search. Evasive, false, or inconsistent response to an officer's question. Sight of an officer. And so the type of information that's collected oftentimes then leaves it up to the office. The officer, of course, is making this determination as to why it would be suspicious for someone to change their direction, why it would be, why someone's response should be considered false. Police department explanation for the collection of this data, interesting. Some of the reasons they give are the need to essentially, and they don't necessarily use the term surveil, they talk about efficiency, but it's essentially a surveillance of the rank and file officer, and to some degree, some control of discretionary power. So, for example, increasing the efficiency in the policing of communities of color by placing greater mechanisms of surveillance on the rank and file. In the estimation of police management, translated, translated into a more appropriate way of doing policing. But what it also translated into was a greater degree of surveillance of communities of color that are typically already the targets of police surveillance. Drive towards efficiency also serves as an avenue for police management to control the broad discretionary powers that the police have been granted, the rank and file police who are actually the ones on the beat. Once they codify power into the type of data collection system that you see in the UF 250, then the police discretionary power, or the power of the rank and file, is actually being controlled in the expanding the control of management over the rank and file use of their discretionary power. So the scientific methodologies and processes underlying these technological development is an important thing for us to pay close attention to. The data that's been collected in the stop and frisk detainments have been used in a variety of the technologies that are important to the expansive grouping and use of surveillance technologies in New York City. And so that would include predictive policing. It would include social media monitoring. It would include facial recognition. It would include license plate readers, gang databases. These are just an example of some of the technologies how some of these technologies are being deployed. Predictive policing now, I think, deserves a great deal of our focus and attention, because it's based in part on the use of algorithmic technologies. It's defined as taking data from disparate sources, analyzing them, and then respond more effectively to future crime. Los Angeles detectives in 2010, Charlie Beck, who was overseeing the use of the incorporation of predictive policing in his department, noted that the predictive vision moves law enforcement from focusing on what happened to focusing on what will happen, to effectively deploy resources in front of crime, thereby changing outcomes. But if we dig deeper and examine the methodologies and processes underlying these technological developments, part of what we would, of course, have to pay attention to is the fact that the use of algorithms and the language oftentimes that are used in the algorithms are essentially organized, or will be organized around the categories, around a system of categories that are used to sort the information. And so I wanted us to take another look again at some of the variables from the UF2 form included in the analysis. And for the purposes of thinking more analytically about the categories that are already starting to emerge from the use from collected, I've organized the variables in the UF 250 form into these categories: biometric, and then the actions leading to a type of suspected criminality. And I've organized the suspected criminality into two categories. Something that violates a norm of propriety, a norm of a crime is a crime that essentially we have we've developed we have socially developed a community developed a communal way of accepting or rejecting these types of behavior. And so we've built norms around these, and their propriety, the crimes that violate norms of propriety. And this comes from the work of Kareem Murji. And in addition to distinguishing the crime, the categories of items into norms of the items that norms of propriety, I've also created another category for them that I call existential crime. And I call these, I think of racial order of a state, or disrupt some other axes of power through which state power is articulated. And so, for example, existential crimes are people's identity. So, for example, in some racial states, historically, particularly in settler states, historically, the people who have been defined as native almost are automatically defined as criminal. The native becomes criminal. And so it becomes important for us to look at the crimes that are tied to people's identity in some way, and not categorize them in the same way that we categorize crimes that violate a community's norms of propriety. Other categories that some of these criteria for stop searches fall into are, of course, an infraction, if an infraction actually occurred, and there are geographic elements and, of course, time elements. And the geographic and time elements are typical elements that are examined during elements that we pay attention to as during surveillance. So the purpose of me using into these categories is to emphasize the way in which the categories that are going to be used to create algorithms, particularly given who the creators typically will be, who they will represent, will likely include categories that heighten the racialization of the people who are being stopped. If we already have a system where the vast majority of stops are taking place in communities that are predominantly Black and Latino, and the vast majority of people who are being stopped, then the collection of these data end up being associated with race and becoming elements or ways in which the sorting of the sorting of the data during data mining and for purposes of just analyzing the data, the sorting takes on this completely racialized elements that embeds certain features into the categories that are predominantly included in the stops. And so furtive movement gets associated with a particular racial group. And it's sometimes, if we think about it in terms of the history of the US, we could see things like furtive movements as being related to the ways in which Blackness was associated with shiftiness or, untrustworthiness. So why is it necessary when we collect this, what is the purpose and the use of this data, and how will it impact the technologies that are being used? How will it impact the citizens, the residents, the people who live in these spaces where the racialization is built into the algorithms? McQuinn argues that once these data are categorized for use, they register or become legible to whatever entity controls the data fields included in the categorization. The data's human originator does not have control over the subject categories that are being placed in. Result from the analysis would become new content or new data for additional data fields. Even if we make the argument that the original data belongs to the human originator, who does the new data belong to as we create or generate with the not just the gathering of data with the technologies, but the analysis of the data with algorithms? We create new generations of data. We see that people and data they leave behind, like shedding skin after online incursions, are vulnerable to being categorized based on how the government or private entity wants to structure the data. Often the data structure is management and not legal criteria, such as presumption of innocence or due process. And so I would presentation with raising this point. We not only do we need to problematize the way in which we think about privacy as we critique use of surveillance technologies, but we also need to problematize the ways in which racialization will take place moving forward, given the ways that they will be incorporated into algorithmic technologies, algorithmic-based technologies. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for another brilliant presentation. So I will now open up for questions which have been submitted via the YouTube live stream. I have a list here so we can work through the list, and for people who are tuned in online, please do submit your questions throughout the discussion, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. So if I could ask you, Lucy and Natalie, to switch your cameras on, and I will begin with the questions that we've already received.
I think
firstly,
I think the host needs to allow us to start up our videos.
Okay, so if we could have those cameras switched on. I'll begin with the first set of questions. We've got 3 related questions, so we can take them together. And I think these apply both to the presentations given by Natalie and Lucy. So the first one is, how does big tech participate and contribute to the global surveillance state and the military? And can general data protection in the US and other countries alleviate this problem? And then the 2 related questions are, firstly, can we expect that general data protection in the US is prepared to prevent racist data collection? And secondly, we know that autonomous systems are part of an extensive socio-technical chain. Is this proposal of Article 36, which involves the idea of meaningful human control, even if there is human participation in autonomous systems, is some regulation foreseen regarding other uses of AI in other parts of the socio-technical chain? So, for example, with collection and mining of data.
Yeah, should I take a crack?
Sure.
that triple. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the place of big tech, and I mean, Natalie made reference to the platforms and to racist capitalism, and I've been tracking efforts on the part of Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google and Alphabet, and his companion Robert Work, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense in the U.S. Defense Department, to promote the place of the technologies that we're talking about, these algorithmic technologies, in military systems. And there's just a whole lot that could be said about that. But big tech plays an enormous role in this, that big tech companies are the ones who have the necessary compute power to do the kinds of automation that we're both talking about in terms of creating these data-driven predictive systems. And just to speak to the question of meaningful human control and the kind of premise of autonomy, and also, I guess, in terms of the question of data governance and regulation. I mean, this goes back to, I guess, my dilemma. I feel so ambivalent about this because on the one hand, I think given the kind of systemic, deep historical, systemic, institutionalized forms of white supremacy and racism that Natalie has been describing, and that equally organize the U.S. military operations, outside of the homeland. I feel that I feel that regulation is necessary but not sufficient, and that our efforts have to include but also go beyond forms of regulation. And in terms of meaningful human control, and there's of course enormous initiatives in the automation, the introduction of so-called artificial intelligence or data, big data analysis into military systems, particularly. And I think this is a place where our concerns really intersect in the case of the algorithmic, the automation of the video surveillance conducted by U.S. drone operations, the kinds of targeting, racialized profiling. I find Natalie's the forms that you've offered absolutely fascinating in terms of the things that are being recognized here as the basis for, in your case, stop and frisk. In my case, it's the identification of a threat. The military talks about patterns of life. So we have these incredibly stereotypical criteria and modes of categorization. And then this fantasy that those are going to be translated into algorithmic, they can be specified into machine executable code. And, that combination is disastrous and can only amplify the injuries that are already created by these kinds of these practices of racialized profiling.
Would you like to answer that set of questions as well, Natalie?
So could I ask you to please repeat the questions? You hear them essentially.
Sure, yeah. So the first one was, how does big tech participate and contribute to the global surveillance state and the military? And can general data protection in the US and other countries alleviate this problem? And the second one, which I think was directed to you in your presentation, was, can we expect the general data protection in the US to be prepared to prevent racist data collection?
I heard part of the first question. How does big tech participate in data protection in the US?
So it's, how does big tech participate and contribute to the global surveillance state and the military? And can general data protection in the US and other countries alleviate this problem?
Oh,
And
okay.
the second question was about whether we can expect general data protection in the US to be prepared to prevent racist data collection.
What can we do to prevent racist data collection?
Whether the GDPR can or has built into it some mechanism to prevent racist data collection.
I'll start with the first one. How does big tech participate or contribute to the global surveillance state? Primarily in the ways in which when you see the blurring of the lines between when big tech steps in to perform much of the building of the prototypes. So, for example, in New York City, big tech was called in to help develop predictive policing in the city, and the work of the big tech companies in that eventually created a problem for the city, because the city wanted to move its work, move the work that had been done to its own platform. To the city, meaning the NYPD in particular, wanted to move the work that they had brought in the big tech companies to do to their own platform. And when they tried to move the work to their platform, big tech's response was, well, the raw data is your data, but anything else that we've done with the data is proprietary. That belong, so essentially they refused to turn that over to the city. And so the subsequent generations of data that develop once data mining occurs is data that can be used by the big tech companies, and we have very little control over that. That I think is one of the ways in which in municipalities people have to step in and demand to find out, what companies are being called in, what technologies are being supported. And oftentimes, for example, the NYPD was accused last year of essentially developing a $159 million surveillance slush fund to use to buy all this equipment for facial recognition, X-ray vans, and software. And none of this was the kind of public oversight. And in the meantime, the city council has been working on a bill to address the reach of and the use of these technologies. But the contribution, that how they participate and how they contribute, in fact, is in a very, very gray area. We don't control, even when it's public data, we have yet to figure out how to manage the subsequent generations of data that are being developed. And maybe, people from the audience can jump in and comment on that also.
So I have another related question, Natalie, from the audience, which is, is there a higher density of surveillance systems in communities of Black people in New York? And is there any form of resistance from these communities against these practices? How have they been organized?
Can I ask you to repeat that one more time?
Sure.
I'm sorry. My connection is, yeah.
Sure. So the question is there a higher density of surveillance systems in communities of Black people in New York? And is there any form of resistance from these communities against these practices? And how have they been organized?
There are forms of resistance to it. Sometimes it takes it emerges sort of through the culture. It emerges through the ways in which people in certain things, but I wouldn't simply say it like that. So, for example, in New York City, the changes or the updating and the technologies that are used for sometimes these things require more and more use of your personal information, or more and more use of personal attributes, you know, and the ways in which sometimes people respond to this is to sometimes just refuse to do those things. So those are simple ways in which that happens. There are other ways in which it happens, though. People are organizing in their communities about this. The Brennan Center, just for example, which operates out of NYU Law School, is one of the places where they regularly collect information on state security and surveillance, and go around and take this information out into groups. So there are community groups that are organizing themselves to be better informed about this, because they just simply have to be. But people are organizing around it. I can't think of anything very specific right now to add to it. It'll come back to me as we go along. It's countervailance.
Maybe just to add to that, another source of resistance is from tech workers in the big tech companies. There have been big organizing efforts around facial recognition technologies among the tech workers. No tech for ICE, for the Immigration and Customs, and also then in terms of the military, both the two big projects coming out of Google, Project Maven, which was the project to automate the analysis of video footage from drone surveillance, and more recently Project Nimbus, which is a new contract between Google and Amazon and the Israeli government. And there's a major tech worker activist campaign against Project Nimbus on the grounds that it will support the Israeli occupation and apartheid system. So I think that's another, along with regulation, I think these forms of activism and resistance are extremely important and growing, I think.
Thank you. So I have another question for Lucy. What have been the main political difficulties of the campaign to stop killer robots before the UN, and which countries have opposed regulation?
Okay, great and timely question. Is there was just another. So this has been going on for 6 years now. These discussions within the CCW. the campaign is now looking for another forum to move the campaign out of the CCW because there has been so little progress there. And there were endless discussions in the beginning about definitions of autonomy. I think those were very well responded to. By autonomy in this context is the automation of the two critical functions of the identification of targets and the initiation of attack. That took it away from, is this system autonomous? Is that system autonomous? By focusing on these critical functions, it took it away from more sort of philosophical, metaphysical discussions about autonomy to, again, these very practical things. So that was progress. The meaningful human control was progress. And I think the campaign and the other civil society organizations made huge contributions there. But the discussions are endless, and basically the sticking point is between countries like the United States, who argue that that international humanitarian law already says everything that needs to be said, and what we need are good practices. And the United States offers itself as exemplary in this regard, offers to, provide tutorials for other countries on how to have, accountable governance of their military operations. So the United States is resistant to the idea of any kind of legally binding treaty, as are a number of other countries, the UK, Canada, the US and its allies, I would say. Russia has been an enormous obstacle to any kind of progress, and particularly resisting the idea of any kind of a binding treaty. And in the last round of negotiations or discussions in the UN, beginning to question the access that civil society organizations have to the discussions. And so I would say the obstacles are stalling tactics, basically, on the part of countries who do not want to be in any way inhibited in their continuing investment in the development of these weapons. And that takes us back to the military, industrial, commercial complex and the enormous economic interests that we're dealing with in the arms industry, which is a whole other dimension of this. So not wanting any kind of restrictions on their ability to invest in research and development. And I would say a wider problem of, and I see this particularly in the United States, an unwillingness to be subject to any kind of multilateral governance structures. And so those things have meant that at least this forum within the UN, which again, it can be easily blocked by countries who put forward opposition. I think the campaign has pretty much come to the conclusion that, again, this has to be, as in the Landmines Treaty, which was negotiated outside of the UN. I think they're now looking for either another forum in the United Nations, moving into the General Assembly, or another forum, or a forum outside of the UN.
Okay, a question for Natalie. Is there any information about which groups and people are involved in producing the variables which you discuss in your presentations, the UF 250 variables that have been appropriated to compose algorithms for predictive systems? And is there any communication between private companies and police forces in the composition of these algorithmic systems? So do the private companies and the police forces work together to create these systems?
Yes. So, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. So in New York City, for example, Palantir Technologies, a Silicon Valley company, provides data analytic technologies to the police departments for the purpose of analyzing crime data in the use of predictive policing and crime control. And they provided this technology for the police department along with other vendors. So there was Azevia and Predpol were two other vendors that were incorporated and in the pilot program. So the new, but apparently the NYPD had been working secretly with Palantir Technologies from before that, from 2012. And before was really about Palantir Technologies. When I said the NYPD had developed, in collaboration with Palantir Technology to do the data analysis of the community. And New York, the NYPD, subsequent to its work with Palantir, eventually developed its own technology to do the work. But and this was the example I was using now, when the city wanted Palantir to move the information, move the data over to the NYPD system, Palantir refused and argued essentially that its algorithms and or data materials are proprietary. And as a result of that, the NYPD did end its relationship with Palantir, but that's how these relationships often work. The public sector turns to the private sector to help them and to support them as they develop technologies. And so Palantir Technology, it's interesting when we think about a company like Palantir. Palantir was did a lot of work with the government in the war in Iraq. And so some of those technologies are essentially coming home and brought back to the community, to communities of color back in the US. Palantir, I haven't checked recently, but it was a company developed by Peter Thiel, the person who was actually friends with the mayor Bloomberg, who we saw this massive expansion of stop and frisk in the city. And Peter Thiel, he's the person who, does that answer the question about, groups or people involved with producing technologies?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I have another question for Lucy here. Many of these predictive technologies and autonomous systems are now being applied in Brazil. How has Brazil positioned itself at the UN regarding weapons systems? Oh, you're still muted, Lucy.
I was just saying maybe we could come back to that because I can pull up some notes that I have on the last round and just check to see where Brazil stood on that. So maybe we can go on and I'll look that up and come back to you.
Absolutely, yeah. So I have another question for Natalie. Facial recognition systems are growing so much globally. Do they pose as much risk as predictive systems in New York? Oh, you're also muted, Natalie.
Okay, all right, that's better. They do pose as much, and maybe for some people as greater risk or greater risk that as greater risk as predictive systems in New York. It's in a lot of the grassroots activism around the surveillance, the excessive expansion of state surveillance, not just within national government, nation states, but globally. In the US, we see grassroots effort targeting facial recognition more than anything else. That's my sense of it. That's how in the past, that's where they see much of the grassroots activism in the targeting of the problem with facial recognition technologies. In New York City, it was recently barred in the schools. That's such an important thing and a big deal, actually, because in my former life, I worked as a journalist. And I used to work with young journalists who were developing stories in communities that are oftentimes underreported by the mainstream press. And one of these young journalists had about the New York Police Department offering kids, minors, $20 in a lineup when they needed extra people to be in the lineup. And so it was almost as if they had a pre-tech way of, because this goes back a few decades now, but they had this, pre-information capitalism way of almost tracking the kids, the young kids in their communities by way of going to the schools and approaching them to help solve. And it was an outrageous practice that didn't actually get a lot of attention. Policing in the schools has been directly tied. Police operating in the schools in the manner that I just described, as well as police being the security in schools, has been tied, quite a bit of research to creating this school to prison pipeline, because the ways in which you end up addressing the problems in that turn up in schools, and this is, you've seen stories in the US of kids as young as 6 being put in handcuffs, pulled out of school and put in handcuffs. So having that level of policing in schools already embedded in the system, in the infrastructure of the education system, and then allowing facial recognition technology in there was just a very dangerous practice. So I was happy to see that in New York, that some of the community pushback stopped the facial recognition in schools.
So, Andrés, I could say a little bit about Brazil.
Please do.
So interestingly, Brazil, the Brazilian ambassador, is the current chair of the this meeting of the CCW. It's called the Group of Governmental Experts. So Brazil is chairing these sessions, which is an enormous job. And I think in some ways that places Brazil a bit outside of the most outspoken of the countries at the moment. However, Brazil is one of their 82 countries who have expressed their support for a legally binding treaty, and Brazil is one of those. Brazil did not participate. There were a whole series of reports submitted before this event by coalitions of countries. Brazil was not part of that. perhaps because they're in the position of chair at the moment. At the end of the meetings, there was a closed session, and this was where the controversy came up about the participation of the civil society organizations, because that closed session was moved out of the main chamber, and the civil society organizations were excluded. But what came out of that at the very end was a weakened set of proposals going forward for not moving forward with towards the negotiation of a treaty, but rather continuing these informal discussions. And I think the sense is that the Brazilian ambassador was subject to a lot of pressure in those closed door meetings, particularly from Russia. And the consequence was that the final report of the discussions was actually weaker than the chair's initial report in terms of progress towards a treaty. So that's kind of my sense of where Brazil is at the moment in these discussions.
Brilliant, thank you. So we need to bring the session to a close now. We have no more questions. Unless Lucy or Natalie, you'd like to make a question or a comment to one another?
Well, I'd be happy to. I mean, first of all, I think that the connections are so powerful in the arenas that we're looking at. And so I'm struck both by the importance of kind of connecting the dots, and also the importance of the levels of specificity with which you're engaged with what's going on in New York City. And in some ways that's a very different arena than the one that I've been operating in. But I see these connections in terms of this commitment to maintaining current orders of largely white supremacy, but with all sorts of complicated expressions of that, by constituting threats, whether those are outside the homeland in the cases that I'm looking at in the form of terrorism, or inside in the form of crime. Both of those overrepresented, both of those treated as the effects of individual bad actors rather than as complex effects of systemic inequality. This idea that you can address those, that you can govern through this kind of command and control and the sort of pseudo-rationality of administration, that the forms that you've shown are indicative of. The enormous amplification of racialized profiling and the moves toward this kind of data-driven predictive targeting based on all sorts of stereotypical behaviors. The growth in institutions of the military, of policing, of incarceration, and the role of the kind of military industrial commercial complex in all of this is just, the cross currents there are really striking to me across the domains that we're looking at.
Likewise to me, yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I have such of a question as a comment for Lucy. I was just your statement about having the human in the loop in military violence is the premise, provides the premise that there is accountability. And I think your framing of that as a pattern of impunity is another way in which our work is connected, because ultimately the desire for to be filled out, because they'd been doing the stops for years, but the push really to enforce filling out this form and collecting the data was in some measure also about being able to scientifically prove that they needed to do what they were doing, and that the system was now free of bias, because between ComStat at first and then the algorithmic technologies, they wanted to be able to say this was, science, and that the system is now free of bias. So having that step in there, as when you said it, I thought, this pattern of impunity is something that I think is another area of connection. So I really, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it just had me thinking in other ways about the material that I've been looking at.
Yeah, likewise.
Brilliant. Well, I'd like to say a huge thanks to Lucy Suchman and Natalie Byfield for your fantastic contributions to this project. And also thanks to the Centre for the Studies of Violence at USP, and also to the British Academy for supporting this event series. And I'd just like to remind everyone about the second panel in the series, which is going to be taking place next week at the same time. So next Thursday at 6 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. Brazil time. And that panel is going to be focused on the risks of AI-based surveillance and control technologies. So I hope we'll see you next week, and we'll close the panel there.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for the invitation to do this.
Yes, thank you very much to the organizers.
Thank you. Bye.